Hi, welcome everyone to another episode of Let's Talk Special Economic Zones. I'm your host Ainsley Brown, and in today's episode, we are going to explore what are non-fiscal incentives and why are they important for zones to leverage. Now, let me just start off by saying zones, whatever you want to call them, and that's part of the challenge with economic zones around the world, is there's various nomenclature that's used for basically the same thing. So special economic zones, free zones, foreign trade zones, in some ways, and in some instances, industrial parks. Depending on the structure, it's all the same thing. That is to say, it is a specially designated area, lawfully so designated, that have special rules attached or associated with them. Now, when it comes to non-fiscal incentives, let's start off with what incentives are. So there are three types really. There are fiscal incentives, financial incentives, and then non-fiscal. Or I guess you could say it's non-fiscal, non-financial, right? So fiscal incentives are basically the tax breaks that we know or understand that typically are associated with investments, particularly foreign direct investments. These can be reduction in income tax. It can be discounts or tax credits and things like that. It can be duty free on importation of raw materials, building materials, works in progress, things of that nature. That those are just typical examples of what are used in zones around the world, or even um, in non-zone areas that are um, governments use fiscal incentives to attract investment. Financial incentives are literally what they are. What it says, financial. They're money. They're cash rewards that the government gives out to attract investors. Not many zones around the world have these, whether in developed countries or developing countries, or in the global south, as it's now being called. But they do exist. They do exist, and they are oftentimes leveraged in a few jurisdictions. When it comes to non-fiscal or non-fiscal slash non-financial, um, these are the soft stuff, the ease of doing business, the governance. In many ways, it is governance as a service, particularly within the context of a zone, whereby you're easing the transaction of one, landing the investment, bringing the investment forward. So you're clearing the way so that the investor who has made the decision to come to the country to invest in your zone regime has a clear path forward. Then after that, of course, they've come to do transactions. So with that, you've cleared the path for them to do their trade, whether they're doing goods and services and or services, whatever they're doing. So some of the examples of non-fiscal incentives, and this is sometimes where people get lost. They mention non-fiscal, but there's not examples being given. Education and training, right? Education and training. And before we get into them, I should have mentioned this. One of the ironies or paradoxes about countries, particularly developing countries, offering non-fiscal incentives, the very reason for the zone or zone regime tends to be the fact that you're trying to either reform your economy in some way, and you need a lab and a place to experiment with policies to see what works before rolling them out into the rest of the economy. But that's an indication that there are issues in the rest of the economy that you're trying to solve, right? So it becomes difficult because those very non-fiscal incentives that you need to offer are already challenging to offer in the regular domestic economy. But then the zones offer you a mechanism through which you can refine these, and of course zones are tend to be, or ought to be at least, the country at its best, right? The country at its best. So, example, as I started off, education and training in terms of free education and training, willingness to train and train to the standard of the investor is one of the ways that Costa Rica landed Intel to bring a chip factory to the jungle, basically, of Costa Rica. And Costa Rica has benefited greatly from that, even after Intel left, well, the chip factory left, but Intel still has investments in Costa Rica. Others are visas and work permits and things like that. The ease at which that can happen, access to labor and how and those are linked to visas, because it's not just about domestic labor. It's about accessing a wider labor pool and how quickly can I get that. I want to bring my people, as an investor, I want to bring my people in, whether they're going to be trainers or just they're going to be actual workers. I want to bring my people in, and that's sometimes a little tricky area because people there's a level of protectionism, and also the government is, and understandably so, the government is giving up something. It expects to get something, and the main thing they want to get, one of the main things I should say, is of course jobs, right? So visas, work permits, those are things, the ease at which, so not just that they exist and you can get them, but how quickly and how easily can you get them. Government procurement and access to government procurement contracts. In another episode, I'm going to get into that a little bit because there's a very good area or unexplored area of what you can leverage as an investment attractor, right? And zones can do it as one sweetener. It's not the only thing that will incentivize folks to come. It also speaks to being able to leverage or to use, as you'll come to see, use local capacities or build local capacity and leverage the existing absorptive capacity of the country. It exists already. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but when I do that episode, you'll understand. Let me see here on my paper. Access to skilled labor, local skilled labor. That's tied to training and willingness to train, but it's also separate. The point is to have a labor pool. Access to raw materials. Somebody might be manufacturing something and they want access to particular raw materials. Access to intellectual property, whether formally or informally. And what by that I mean, you may have formal registered patents and things like that. But then you may also have a certain brand, a certain vibe about you that you want your product to be associated with, like France. France has a certain romantic, um, dare I say, je ne sais quoi associated with it. Jamaica has a certain vibe, for example. So you want to have that association, so you're going to go produce in that country. That brand France and brand Jamaica are not actual pieces of intellectual property that are registered, but there are a certain vibe, a certain thing that can be leveraged, and brands do, right? um, Infrastructure, very big one. Infrastructure, is there the necessary infrastructure there for um, the type of activity that you want to conduct? Not just where you would go, like factory space. I'm talking the port, the airport, the roads, those sorts of infrastructure. There's also the legal system. Or could I forget that? The legal system. How efficient is it? Is it based particularly on the English system, which tends to be where a lot of people gravitate towards? If so, that can be leveraged. Singapore does that very nicely around the world. England, Britain, UK does that as well, in terms of attracting investments. Um, and knowing that legal system is there just in case something goes wrong, and then you have to resort to the courts for resolving disputes. Um, what else should I put on here? Your location. Could I forget that one? Your location. These are God given fiscal incentives, things that the country was born with, so to speak. But it's a question of, just because you're born with an ability doesn't mean that it's resulted in anything. It's how you leverage it. So your location to a larger market, relative to a larger market, your location to a access way, a waterway, a choke point in the global trading system, your telecommunication systems overlapping or intersecting with various telecommunication systems around the world, um, things like that. Another one, cheap energy, particularly access to renewable resources, the sun, right? The sun. Um, but the question is, how do you leverage it? So non-fiscal incentives, while they can be natural endowments, unless you leverage them, they're meaningless. Now, why it's important for zones to start to leverage these even more, because they do already, is that the pressures that are coming on from, for example, the OECD with the overall global economic governance structures that are there and strictures that are there, the OECD base erosion and profit shifting, global minimum corporate income tax, or Pillar Two, for example, which is part of the inclusive OECD inclusive framework, right? It's limited the policy space in terms of how do you craft fiscal incentives to attract folks to, and fiscal incentives typically are done to make up or compensate for the deficiencies that a particular country may have, to sweeten the pot, right? But oftentimes, unfortunately, they're used as the cake that attracts rather than the icing on the cake, right? They're the add-ons. They're not the actual cake, the body. And whenever it's used as the body, there tends to then be rent-seeking on the part of the investors, and also there tends to be a lot more fluidity in terms of them leaving when that's the case. But whereas the non-fiscal incentives, particularly ones that are natural endowments, um, you can't pick those up and move them. They belong to the country and can't be moved. And if that's what you're dependent on, or that's what you're attracted to, you're gonna keep that investment and possibly multiply it. So a little long today, but if you like this episode, please like, share, subscribe. If you want to see me do a particular episode, just leave me a message down below and I'll get right back to you. Bye for now.